President Putin has ordered the start of the withdrawal of Russian forces from Syria. And RT's Daniel Hawkins joins me with the studio, can't even get my teeth in there, Dan, in the studio with the details. Well, hi there, Dan. So does that mean that Russia's mission in Syria is over?
Well, according to some, that will be the case in terms of the military phase, certainly. This was announced by President Putin, as you mentioned, in a surprise visit to Khmeimim Airbase in Latakia. It's part of his Middle Eastern visit, where he will also meet the Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi after leaving Syria as well. As you mentioned, he's officially given the order for Russian troops to withdraw from the country, although the Russian airbase in Latakia, as well as the naval base, of course, will remain. He has made it clear, though, that if terrorists, according to his words, rear their heads again, Russia won't hesitate to strike them down once again. Now, since 2015, of course, the launch of Russia's air campaign, the Syrian army's regained vast amounts of territory, as much as 90% of the country. The Russian warplanes who were involved in the operation, the Russian troops, have destroyed thousands of targets, command posts, oil infrastructure, training camps, etc., and participated in some of the key military operations of the war, the liberation of Aleppo, of Palmyra twice, and of Deir ez-Zor as well. In addition, of course, to helping fight jihadists, Russian troops on the ground have been actively engaged in demining those areas most affected by the conflict as well. The active phase of fighting the most battle-hardened jihadists, according to the Russian government, is over, and now the switch goes over to the political process as well. We can have a look now at some of the key moments that the Russian troops have been involved in since 2015.
The so-called Islamic State of Syria and Iraq is a state no more. For all intents and purposes, says the Russian Defense Ministry, it has been destroyed as a faction. There are still hotspots and isolated pockets, Vladimir Putin added, but with the liberation of the west bank of the Euphrates River, ISIS is done. 799 days after Russia got involved in September 2015. When ISIS was arguably at its peak. When the Russian operation began, ISIS held more territory in Syria than any other faction. 2 years and a few months on, the caliphate has been reduced to clumps of villages and uninhabited desert. It wasn't the Russian Air Force alone that did this. The US-led coalition also played a huge part. We've been covering the Syrian civil war in depth before ISIS even had its name, before jihadists hijacked the rebels' cause. Here are some of the more memorable moments filmed by my colleagues and I. This is the airbase in Latakia from which Russian jets are launching their sorties against Islamic State targets here in Syria. Whether it's 3 in the morning, 12 in the afternoon or dinner time, the pilots are ready to go at a moment's notice. In this amphitheater laid down by the Romans almost 2,000 years ago, that ISIS staged one of its sickest massacres. The Russian military considers it the crowning jewel of their operation here in Syria.
You can see here just some of the impressive military hardware that ISIS have in their possession that has made the battle for Palmyra so tough. We're extremely close to ISIS positions, less than 2 kilometers away.
We're at a Syrian artillery position overlooking the industrial quarter of Deir ez-Zor. The battle is said to be fierce. ISIS fired back. As we filmed, shells began falling all around. We ran, but the Syrian batteries kept firing. Life in Deir ez-Zor is still far from normal, but at least they won't be starving to death anymore. Ultimately, it wasn't Russian or American jets that played the decisive role in this. This victory belongs to the Syrians, the thousands and thousands who fought and died to defeat ISIS. Those who stood up to jihadists even when it seemed nothing could stop them. Unfortunately, it's unlikely that this will end here. Many ISIS fighters have escaped or gone underground. Their sleeper cells will terrorize the world for years to come. But now, they'll no longer have their caliphate to fight for.
Well, to discuss all these issues in more depth, we're now joined by Ammar Wakaf, Director of Knossos, a British think tank that focuses on crises in Syria and the Middle East. Thank you very much indeed, Ammar, for joining us. I mean, what do you make of this unexpected trip to Syria?
Well, it was quite surprising. We knew all along that President Putin would be visiting Turkey and Egypt later on, but then, you know, would he stop at Khmeimim? I don't think anybody thought about this. Especially, there is nothing new, but this is very highly significant because it gives you the impression that there is a large feel or a growing confidence in Syria, in the stability of Syria and so on. But this is definitely a surprising visit, and it tells you again, that things are going forward, major combating operations regarding the announcement itself, of course, of withdrawal of major combat units, major operations are now coming to an end and things are heading, hopefully, in the right direction.
And Ammar, Daniel Hawkins here in the studio alongside Kate here. This has been labelled the end of this sort of active military phase here and the beginning of what's going to be a long and probably quite complex political process for the country. How significant exactly is that transition into that political negotiation phase now?
Well, it's going to take a long time. It will be very hard to convince all stakeholders, especially those who are influenced heavily by states who do not really want stability in Syria, to take part, or actually to take active part or proactive part, a constructive part, so to speak, in building a new Syria, so to speak. I think the contrast itself, or the stark contrast between the Russian announcement of withdrawing major combat units or Russian forces, main combat units, and the American declaration after declaration of increasing their forces in Syria and putting them indefinitely uninvited, by the way. It tells you that Russia has invested heavily, predominantly to secure legitimacy in Syria, to support the state and stability, basically, whilst the Americans have always and will always continue, apparently, to undermine the state and undermine stability in Syria. So make no mistake, this is not going to happen very soon, and there will be parties who will be swayed by America's brand name. If we stick with the Americans and don't join with the central government, then probably we would be better. But at the end of the day, it's very unsustainable, and hopefully, we will get this nightmare behind our backs very soon.
And on that basis then, Ammar, I mean, looking at the consensus of agreement that ISIL is defeated or there are only pockets of resistance remaining, do you think that other foreign countries involved in the Syria conflict will follow the Russian example and announce their withdrawals as well?
Well, as I said, the Americans are not going to do so. They've in fact announced that they are beefing up their forces. They apparently would want to keep a certain, I wouldn't say enclave, because it's actually a large segment of Syria that is now controlled by Syrian Democratic Forces, as independent as possible, so that they think they could influence, it is what they think, they could influence the political process, in a sense, as a pressure card. But that would only lead to instability. There is also the enclave in Idlib, where the Syrian army has just started major operations in North Hama, Western Aleppo, and Idlib itself, where Al-Qaeda or Jabhat al-Nusra are basically still there, and it will take also time to clear them and reinstate that piece of land into Syria. So we're not, it will take time, but certain players have different agendas and different objectives, and the Americans, they feel that if they hold enough pressure cards, like in northeastern Syria and in southern Syria. They could probably influence the political process and have their voices heard. And, you know, we're going to suffer a little bit due to that, but hopefully things will come right at the end.
Just looking back at the last 2 years, since 2015, Amar, Russia's obviously faced some negative reaction, a lot of criticism as well for its operations in Syria. That's not something that we can get away from. The main achievement, without a doubt, has been by the Syrian army, of course, in liberating the country. But just from a tactical point of view, how significant was Russia's involvement militarily in backing up the Syrian army on the ground?
Well, first of all, everybody needs to know that the Russian involvement has been highly appreciated by a lot of people who did not really want neither this revolution or, you know, the huge support that it got from regional powers, you know, 120, 130 countries. They wanted to maintain their government. They didn't want Syria to go to shreds, just like what happened in Iraq or Libya or now, as we can see, Yemen. And I think Russia helped a lot with that, and it really deserves a lot of credit, and a lot of people are really full with gratitude towards that. In a sense, from a tactical point of view, it was at the time when Russia came, it was a bleak moment, that's for sure. Nothing, in a sense, said that Syria's government was going to collapse at all. And we could also sense a lot of Russia's support before that. And I think the main proof of that Russian support was that no NATO operation whatsoever started in Syria between the year 2011 and the year 2015. In a sense, so Russia was always behind the scenes, you know, the Security Council, and that all helped keep the state on its feet. Now, militarily, the surge of air power, especially, did help turn the tide. And also, most importantly, the psychological factor, you know, the rebels, the militants, they suddenly felt that the Russians are coming here, and now we're not only fighting a government that is, or a regime, so to speak, that is, whose fall is imminent. Now there is a superpower. So that, you know, affected their morale, that affected their performance in a sense, and that helped sway other countries in the region, like Turkey, for example, who is and still is unhappy with what the United States is doing in northeastern Syria, to come to their senses and try, having realized that the fall of the government in Damascus was never going to be imminent, come to their senses and start, you know, some sort of a constructive role. I think all in all, both politically, militarily, and even economically, if you want to put it that way, it helped a lot. And a lot of Syrians, I can assure you, appreciate that.
Indeed. Amar Wakaf, we'll leave it there. If you can just hold on just a few minutes, we'll come back to you to talk about other issues. In the meantime, then.